Welcome to the Politics of Everything. I'm Amber Daines, your host and podcast producer. This is a half hour of power, a podcast dropping every week where I unpack the politics of everything, from money to motherhood, nutrition to narcissism, startups to secularism, the environment, equality, and much, much more. Our guests are seasoned in the field or topic of their choice, even if you've not heard of them yet. This is a non-partisan show. So while I love exploring varied views and get a buzz from a healthy debate of ideas, this is not a purely blue, white, green program. Please subscribe, tune in and enjoy the politics of everything. Oil is a divisive issue. Climate change debates remain as heated as ever in Australia, with nuclear energy, renewables and the legacy realities of oil and gas being a necessity remaining at the heart of this story. In the face of our climate crisis, my guest today says now is the time for a wake-up call to the danger of unchecked power and influence. Royce Kurmelovs' latest book is called Slick, Australia's Toxic Relationship with Big Oil, and it's a damning portrait of greed, ignorance and environmental neglect, leaving not a shred of doubt as to the oil and gas industry's complicity in the climate crisis we face. Royce is actually a journalist and author whose reporting has appeared in numerous publications such as Rolling Stone, Science, The Guardian, The Saturday Paper, Jazeera English, and a range of other publications. Royce's best-selling first book, The Death of Holden, explored the closure of the Australian car industry on communities across South Australia and Victoria. His critically acclaimed second book, Rogue Nation, published in 2016, documented the fracturing of Australian politics. His third book, Boom and Bust, presented a portrait of Western Australia after the mining boom, while his fourth book, Just Money, revealed the pyramid of debt on which Australia's economy was built. And this is a huge topic, and I can't wait to get stuck into it with Royce on the politics of everything. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to hear you.
Podcasting remotely can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be. Since day one of the politics of everything, I have relied on Zencastr's all-in-one solution to make the process quick and painless, the way it should be for those of us who just love great content and want to get our ideas out into the world. If you know me, I'm obsessed with quality in terms of my guests, my sound, and everything about my show has to be great the first time. I'm time poor. It's so easy to use Zencastr. I'm not tech savvy and you don't need to be either. There's nothing to download. Just click on the link and off we go. Zencastr is all about making your podcasting experience easy, and with everything from local recording to automatic post-productions now in their toolkit, you don't have to leave your browser to get that episode done, and done fast. I have a special offer for you, and hopefully you can experience what I have with Zencastr. Go to zencastr.com/pricing and use my VIP code, The Politics of Everything, all lowercase in one word, to get 30% off your first 3 months of Zencastr Professional. How good is that? I want you to have the same easy experiences I do for all my podcasting and content needs. It's time to share your story. Young journalist always, or did you think you might do something else? It sounds like you've had a pretty solid career.
No, when I was much younger, much more foolish, I actually was playing with the idea of going into something completely different, software engineering. And then I discovered that involves a hefty amount of maths and mathematical type thinking, which wasn't really for me. So after that, I really love storytelling and writing, and I decided that journalism was the best way to do words for money, which, again, I think I was wrong on that score. But
you make some money.
You
don't make investment banking levels of money,
no,
but yeah.
But truth and justice, But I've made it this far, and that's good. So, and then the pivotal moment though was I went to the US briefly and was just an intern at one point, and I was working at this dying paper, writing this feature, and I remember thinking to myself, this is fantastic. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And from that moment, I was kind of ruined for other careers.
Excellent. I love it. I love joining the dots on where people have started and, of course, where they've ended up today. Your book, Slick, investigates the Australian oil industry to understand what they knew about climate change, when they knew, and how they worked to make sure nothing was done to address it. What got you interested in this topic? Because obviously you've written about very diverse issues in the past. Why this one and why now?
Yeah, it was an interesting turn for me because, at the time, I think I was working as an environment reporter with The Guardian. And the more you're reporting on this issue, particularly at that time, there was just report after report and story after story, kind of really underscoring the gravity of this existential threat at this moment and how humanity had to do something. And it was a real education in terms of this subject that like I suspect many people, kind of know a bit about, but haven't really looked at in close detail. And then everything I was doing was looking at everything from extreme weather effects to knock-on effects for agriculture and cities, and the sponsorship of arts and sports by fossil fuel companies and all these sorts of things. And it was really clear to me then, as other people have said, that everything is now a climate story. And when we talk about that, when we had that conversation here in Australia, as I think you hinted at in the opening, that things have been so tense around the subject of climate change in this country for so long. A lot of the conversation, about this doesn't necessarily focus on who was responsible for this or how we ended up in this spot. And so, that got me thinking. And so my first step was to go to an industry conference, which was run by the largest oil and gas lobby group in the country. That they do it every year. And the people that go to this thing are the people that kind of shape the identity of the industry and then do the long-term planning. And I really wanted to see how they were talking about climate change. But the 3 days I spent there, I found that they really weren't. And that got me digging, because I started to get curious. I was like, well, let's learn more about this and what Australia was doing. So I set out to look at I set out to go look through kind of all the old industry documents where I could, materials where I could find them, to kind of learn what the oil and gas industry in Australia knew about climate change, when they knew it, what they were saying, and then what they did with this information. And based on this, I found things like, for instance, that in 1972, for instance, right, the Australian oil and gas industry was having a conversation about what they then called the greenhouse effect on the floor of their national conference, where everyone was listening and talking. They were aware that there was a risk. They were aware that burning fossil fuels was causing a problem and that we'd have to do something about it. And they were quite freely talking about it. And that was really significant for me because, as like many people, if you talk to them, will generally kind of think that climate change as an issue really kind of emerged in the 90s. We started talking about it then. But as it turns out, this is wrong. We've actually known there was risk for almost half a century at this point. And so,
wow.
Yeah. And that was the first step. The next step was then to take it one further and say, well, it was to learn about how the industry developed and how it was connected to the US industry and how they knew about climate change and how they were actively researching this stuff even earlier than that. And they transferred that knowledge across.
Yeah. Wow. It's interesting to know how, I guess, complicit, the oil industry has been. But of course, it's not just up to them. There's obviously other players involved.
Well, yeah, but there's a really fascinating story about this, right? Which is that a lot of this stuff originated with people started getting really concerned about the smog over Los Angeles. And
yes, I do remember that. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember that.
Exactly. Come on. Yeah. So people still really concerned about this, right? And when there was one researcher in particular who was kind of looking at it and started to point out that, hey, we've got all these cars on the road, they're burning petroleum, it's creating the smog. And then, so that was the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened was the link between smoking and cancer got discovered in about 1950. And a lot of these oil executives, particularly in the US, were looking at this, putting two and two together and saying, oh, well, if people start, connecting the dots here, they're going to start trying to sue us like they're doing to the tobacco guys. So we've got to do something about this. And at that point, they started putting an actual legitimate money into this sorts of stuff, and really kind of working up the research. And what you find are these extraordinary reports, these extraordinary stories from these scientists who are hired from the industry over periods through the 60s and through the 70s, saying, hey, this is a serious problem we have to do something about. The unfortunate thing is that the industry then never went and shared that science with anyone else.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. No, it's very similar parallels there as well. Will climate risks and our energy debates ever be settled by science alone? It seems like, there are still climate change deniers out there. It's sort of a breed of thought which doesn't seem to be getting any bigger. But I feel like you can tell people all the things, show them all the graphs, and there is still people who don't seem to be taking this very seriously.
Well, it's funny you ask that. That's actually a very it's a big and important question. And I think what surprised many climate scientists in later years is that they were quite shocked and quite they thought that if they had put the evidence on the record, if they said that this is what their conclusions are, that people would naturally have to respond because they're pointing out a threat, and rationally you have to address this. But that's not how it kind of happened. What happened instead, and you've got to take a few steps back to kind of get to this, is that when especially these oil companies, when they were doing these research programs, they had their internal scientists saying to them, "Hey, this is a problem." There was, you can find these documents. There was one internal briefing where scientists said, "Hey, like if we don't stop, like burning oil, gas, and coal, we're going to have this real problem with the climate." And the companies in turn turned around and said, "Okay, thanks for that. We appreciate your input. But what we're going to do is we're going to lean into the uncertainty and doubt around the science, and we're going to really play that up in public." And there's a famous document it's called the Exxon Memo, where they basically say those exact words, that we're going to emphasize the uncertainty and doubt. And the reason why that is really effective when it comes to the politics of this is that politicians do not like something where it's uncertain. And if they're being asked to make a big, bold step, a big major change, and suddenly the rug gets pulled out from under them, say, the next year, 5 years later, that's really scary for them. And so by creating this by feeding that sense of doubt, by feeding that sense of climate denial, it basically brought things to a standstill for 20 years. It took the world that much longer to catch up because you had to make sure the evidence was much stronger. And so,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah. That makes sense though, when you put it that way, that kind of, the logic around the politics is kind of behind most of this, as well as what's happening with big business.
Yeah. And the lesson here really is that like science itself is political. So, and we tend to think of it as this kind of innate objective, this question, but it's who's putting together, like it's those questions, who's funding the reports, who's putting them together, how are they being presented, who is receiving that message, all those things that make for good communication.
Absolutely. How can we get off this oil alliance train? I wish there was, you could turn one tap off per se and then turn the other on for alternative energy sources. A lot of economies, including ours, have still got a long way to go to be able to be free, if you like, of the oil and gas reliance. Is there a pathway which you think, based on what you know so far, is going to help that happen?
I mean, this is kind of a good news, bad news situation. So I guess the good news is that we are doing it. We are already going along that path. The situation is that you both have to stop the extraction of fossil fuels and you have to stop the consumption by kind of ending demand, stop people from using this. And we already have good examples in Australia, at least, good examples of where that's taking place. We have Victoria, where the state government ended gas connections in new homes, which means that if you wanted a gas connection in your house, if you're building a house, you have to pay extra for that. And then we have situations like South Australia where, solar penetration is just through the roof. It forms a huge part of the energy grid. And there are some kind of weeks where the entire state power grid is powered by, solar and wind energy, for a given period because it's just that bright. And we're also seeing, as that continues, we're seeing those sorts of uptake white at existing, coal and gas operations, which don't have the flexibility to turn on and off when they need to. And so you're seeing that change kind of go through. Other states, that are dragging their feet. Mostly they've been waiting for the federal government to kind of do the heavy lifting on this stuff. And there's a big conversation to be had about ending kind of fossil fuel subsidies and going further, faster, which is what really needs to be done. But, that question you talk about, when we zoom out and look globally, that conversation is also underway as well. So last year in Dubai, there was a big international climate meeting. It's called the Conference of the Parties, or COP. And I was there, and I report about this. I write about this in the final chapter of the book, where the conversation there was about what people were expecting was a plan to phase out coal, oil, and gas from the world's energy grid. And people were really pushing for it because it's been 20 years of this kind of organized international framework. And the feeling was now was the time to make that happen. And what ended up coming out of that meeting, under considerable pressure from groups like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and a few other fossil fuel producing nations, was not so much a plan to phase out coal, oil, and gas, but kind of the beginning of the end. What was agreed to was a plan to start phasing out oil and gas, but there were several loopholes and caveats included.
Caveats, yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I've looked at some of that as well. I've got clients in that space, and one of my clients, he was also at the last COP, and it just feels like a talk fest sometimes, I have to say.
It was a very interesting experience being there on the ground. If you're a cynical person, it can kind of inflame some of those feelings. But
there you go. You've pinned me in one.
well, yes, but but at the same time, I mean, the fact, I mean, you have to recognize where at least a little bit of progress has been made, and the fact that people were able to agree and to actually say, yes, we do need to phase this out, that was significant, but it needed to be more.
Yeah, the devil's in the detail too, I imagine, as well.
Absolutely.
How can energy become more democratic? I mean, I'm aware that, I've just come back from a work trip in the Philippines, for example, places like Africa. They can't necessarily afford to invest or switch over into these new technologies, which are less oil reliant, like countries like Australia or the US or parts of Europe. What do you think will help make that clean energy transition fairer and therefore globally and holistically maybe faster?
Well, it's actually a really good question as well, because one of the ongoing international issues right now is it's long been recognized in these kind of climate frameworks that developed countries, because they've been polluting for longer since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and that's how they made their money, that they're under an obligation to put up the cash to help developing countries transition. That wasn't necessarily addressed last year, but it's expected to be kind of addressed this year in Azerbaijan. Whether or not it is remains to be seen. But that is that is a live issue right now. But what's also really interesting about this is how that issue and that question of, okay, well, how do we best help developing countries can be really weaponized by oil and gas companies. And when you hear them talk about this, they say two things that I find always really, really interesting. The first is that they have this idea that developing countries have to follow a kind of very rigid linear path when it comes to their own use of renewable energy and getting off of coal, oil, and gas, because they have this idea that you have to build the coal power plants, which let you do the gas power plants, which let you do the solar stuff once you get some money. But that's not true. The experience from places like Africa with mobile phones, for instance, is not that these people moved from a rotary landline phone to a brick mobile before they eventually arrived at the smartphone. What they did was just leapfrog to the smartphone when it became affordable enough. And this is the second part of the conversation, which is right now, the amount of solar panels China produces on a day could form a mountain. Thanks to that kind of just industrial output and the cheap solar panel, solar power is the cheapest electricity production that has ever existed as long as humans have been walking around this planet. And that means it is possible to make that transition. And once you get those kind of arrays set up, you start plugging people into that. They're no longer dependent on the kind of vagaries of an electricity grid where you might have, in particular countries, like everything from, on one end of the spectrum, corrupt officials to just kind of bad maintenance to, all sorts of stuff going on. And it does, and by encouraging and setting up those sorts of operations, you do kind of put the power back in the hands of those people, so to speak.
Absolutely. No, I think that all makes sense. Let's make it happen faster, as we all would love to see. Changing tack a little bit, I asked my guests a few consistent questions, and I've got these for you as well. Do you have a non-negotiable favourite daily habit?
I do. You can't see me right now, but I'm actually a very tall guy. And so if I'm being honest, I'm a big fan of breakfast. And if I don't get that kind of blood sugar stabilized every morning consistently, I get cranky and mean, and no one really wants to deal with that.
No intermittent fasting for you or 5-2 diets.
No, that's deeply concerning to me.
I love it. I do love breakfast too. I don't know. I'm not crazy tall, but I could probably skip dinner more than I could skip breakfast. I always think I can't handle being hungry in the morning, and I do my best work in the morning, so I feel like I need all the fuel to get my brain and body going.
Absolutely. New day, fresh pot of coffee. Say start things right.
Perfect. Excellent. What's been your biggest life lesson to date, and what's it taught you?
This is a very philosophical question, and if you allow me to get deep for a second, I think it's basically that I think you got to give people a chance to be noble. I think 9 times out of 10 people will probably disappoint you, but every now and then, when you give people a chance, they will step up and do something incredible and right where it counts. And I think that is the stuff that kind of keeps you going.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's good. It's a deep question. I expect a deep answer, so I think that was bang on. How do you define your own version of success?
This is another very deep question. So we're getting very philosophical. Uh, it's interesting. So a few years back, I once saw an interview with Stephen Fry, the British actor, where he talked about living the artistic life. And bear with me, it has a point to it. But what he was really pointing out was that if you live a really focused, goal-driven lifestyle, you tend to be unhappy whenever you get to where you're going because you find out that what you're expecting it to be like is not really, it kind of sucks. And what he was suggesting is that it's better to do the interesting thing, to be willing to change tack when something else comes up and follow that, and as a result you wind up in a happier place because you still work for it, but you didn't have the expectations about what it will be like. And when I think about in my own life, for me, the only two things I ever wanted to do was essentially publish a book and get published in Rolling Stone. And
Oh, you've done those.
Yeah, exactly. I've achieved those things. So for me, everything else is a bonus from this point.
Yeah, I like that. I think that sounds like you've kicked the goals that you set for yourself, and that's pretty satisfying. I think there's always more we could do, but I think sometimes it's good to be happy with what we have already achieved.
Yeah.
What would be a final takeaway message for us today on the politics of oil?
I think if I was to take it, if I was to look at this, it would be that climate change really is an existential threat, but it's not too late to do something about it. And if there's a sense of kind of it's very easy to feel a sense of kind of despair or fatalism or hopelessness, but it's also important to remember that there are people out there who want you to feel that way because it means that they can continue making lots of money from this situation. But there is a much better, cleaner, healthier world to win if we do what's necessary to address this, if we phase out oil, gas, and coal. And as I said, in some ways we're doing it. We just have to go faster.
Yeah, let's make it happen. Thank you so much for your time today, Royce. And of course, there are details of how to connect with Royce, find out more about his various books, including his latest one, Slick, on the website. Until next time, do take care. Thank you. Thanks so much for listening today. If you've enjoyed the politics of everything, I thrive on your feedback. So please add a short review and share the podcast with your network through Apple, Spotify, and all the usual suspects. I'm always on the hunt for new and diverse guests, so if you or someone you know has a fresh idea you're busting to get out there, please email me at amber@amberdanes.com and my crew will get back to you very soon.